Welcome to the presentation on Infrastructure Servers Licensing, looking at the licensing of Small Business Server, BizTalk Server and SQL Server. My name is Vicky Lee and I will be taking you through this presentation today. In this presentation, we're going to go through taking a look at Small Business Server 2008, BizTalk Server 2009 and SQL Server 2008 R2, starting with Small Business Server. Small Business Server is a collection of server products aimed, as the name suggests, at small businesses. It comes in two editions, the Standard Edition and the Premium Edition. The Standard Edition consists of Windows Server and Exchange Server and an administration console to set up the end users. The Premium Edition has the whole of Small Business Server Standard Edition, plus an extra Windows Server license and a SQL Server license. This SQL Server license being ideal as a back-end for any line of business application that might require SQL. Small Business Server is aimed at businesses of up to 75 in size, as it only supports 75 simultaneous user or device connections. So it is an ideal product for any company that is smaller than 75, leaving a little bit of space for room for growth as new employees are employed. Small Business Server is licensed using our ServerCal licensing model. So a company wanting to put in the Standard Edition of Small Business Server would buy a Small Business Server Standard Edition license, and that would license them to install Windows Server and Exchange Server and the admin console onto their server. They would then need to license their end users or devices to access the services of that server. Now, on the left-hand side, we have individual users that are using multiple devices, and they would be licensed per user. So for them, you would buy a Small Business Server Standard Edition UserCal Suite. Whereas on the right-hand side, where we have a device that is being used by multiple users, we would license that per device, and we would purchase the Small Business Server Standard DeviceCal Suite. If we had external users, i.e. non-employees, accessing the services of our Small Business Server, we could also purchase them the Small Business Server Standard Cal Suite. And that Standard Cal Suite does license you to access any other Windows Server or Exchange servers sitting in the organisation. If it was the Premium Edition of Small Business Server that you're putting into place, you would purchase your Small Business Server Premium Edition license, and that licenses you to install Windows Server on two separate boxes, one running Exchange and one running SQL Server. For those end users that you need to access the SQL Server component, you would buy them the Small Business Server Premium Cal Suite. For the end users that don't need to access SQL, they could stay with the Small Business Server Standard Cal Suite. So it's perfectly acceptable to mix both the Premium and Standard Small Business Server Cal Suites. The Small Business Server Premium Suite does license you, again, for any other SQL servers that you might be running in the organisation. Now, when it comes to purchasing Small Business Server, it can be bought as a full package product, giving you immediate access to the software, and that does include 5 CALs. Or alternatively, you can go for an OEM installation. So in other words, you're going to buy a brand new server with Small Business Server pre-installed on it. And that again comes with 5 CALs. Small Business Server is also available through volume licensing. And again, if you do purchase through volume licensing, 5 CALs are included with the Small Business Server editions. CALs are then available in CAL packs, and they can be available in packs of 1, 5 or 20. So moving on from Small Business Server, let's take a look at BizTalk Server 2009. So first of all, we've got to think about what BizTalk Server does. Now, BizTalk is really a translator sitting between server applications that can't talk to each other and enabling them to talk to each other. And this has really evolved as time has evolved. If you think in the early days of computers were very separate. You'd have separate mainframes, one working maybe the finance system, one maybe working the purchasing system. They were separate, they didn't talk to each other, and really that was fine. As time has evolved, we do expect our systems to be connected together, and it's always quite surprising if you do have server applications that can't talk to each other. So if you do have that, you would use BizTalk. BizTalk would sit in the middle and it would act as a translator between those applications that can't talk to each other, making them talk to each other. It will also manage workflow between those different applications, giving these business processes. When you look at the licensing of BizTalk Server, you will see, if you look at the bottom of the slide, that it does come in a number of different editions, but those editions are all licensed per processor. So it's really a case of counting up the number of physical processors sitting in your server, and again, we don't charge more for multi-core processors, and buying the appropriate number of processor licenses. So in our servers here, each server is running 4 processors. So if we were licensing BizTalk on all of those servers, we would buy 4 processor licenses per server, and that would then license you for everybody to access the services of that server, be they employees of the company or external users. There are, however, a couple of things that you do need to be aware of when licensing BizTalk Server. So when it comes to the Enterprise edition of BizTalk Server, as you would expect, that happily uses all of the processors in your server. So as we mentioned before, if your server has 4 processors in it, you must buy 4 BizTalk Server Enterprise processor licenses. That's fine. Standard edition, however, can technically only work with 2 processors, even if the server has more processors in there. So obviously if you were running standard edition on a 2 processor server, that's great, you'd buy 2 processor licenses and everything's fine. If you were running it on a 4 processor server, because Windows Server, which would be sitting underneath BizTalk, would be utilising all 4 processors, you would then need to buy 4 processor licenses. So it is quite important to note that even though it technically can only use 2 processors, you will need to license all of the processors that Windows Server is utilising. So one thought might be that it is worth only putting Standard Edition on a server with up to 2 processors on it. The note at the bottom just commenting on the fact that the Enterprise edition of BizTalk is licensed for an unlimited number of virtual processors on a single physical server. Okay, so let's move on now to SQL Server 2008 R2. And if we take a little recap on what SQL actually does for us. SQL is our server-based relational database. So it's all about taking data and turning data into useful information. And what tools does SQL have in place to do that? Well, you can see on this picture at the top that we have got a lot of data being held in a lot of back-end systems. Now, SQL Server will take the data from all of those back-end systems using something called the integration services, and will put all of that data into a large data warehouse. So the data warehouse is just a big store of all of the data held in your systems. The analysis services feature in SQL will then slice and dice that data and allow you to pull out the snippets of information that you need, feeding that information into the reporting services. The reports created in the reporting services are then pushed out to the relevant person, meaning that the relevant person can see useful, actionable information that has been taken from the raw data in the back-end systems. And SQL is powering all of that for us. Now, SQL comes in a number of different editions, again aimed at different sizes of organisation and different uses. So the 3 core editions are the Standard, Enterprise and Data Center editions. And you'll see Standard really aimed at departmental or small to medium scale database deployments, whereas the Enterprise edition is for the larger scale business critical, and the Data Center edition is very high end, higher scale and even more business critical than potentially Enterprise. The Web edition is there for supporting websites and web applications. The Parallel Data Warehouse edition is for data warehousing and is a new edition with the SQL Server 2008 R2. And then down at the bottom we have a Developer edition, again aimed at, as the name might suggest, developers. We have a Compact and Express edition, which are both free editions, either for client embedded solutions or sort of for entry level solutions. And finally the Work Group edition aimed at small scale and branch office deployments. There are some technical restraints with SQL Server when it comes to the hardware support, and we're really just considering here the 3 core editions. So you'll see the Standard edition only supports up to 4 processors and 64 gigabytes of memory, whereas the Enterprise edition is up to 8 processors and 2 terabytes of memory, and the Data Center edition will support more than 8 processors, and the memory will top out at the operating system maximum. Now, when it comes to licensing SQL Server actually has a choice on how it is licensed. You can license it in the Server CAL licensing model, or you can license it through the per processor licensing model. So let's take the Server CAL licensing model first. And again, in this example here, we have 3 servers in our company that are all running SQL Server. We also have our end users and our external users who will access that SQL Server. So the first thing that we would need to do is to purchase 3 SQL Server licenses and assign them to those 3 servers running in the organisation. And then we would need to purchase CALs. And obviously we would purchase SQL Server user CALs for the users that are using multiple devices to access the services of the server, and device CALs for those devices that are being used by multiple users. Our external user or non-employees would also have CALs purchased for them to allow them to access SQL Server. And the other thing to note down at the bottom is something known as multiplexing. If you have a user or device that is accessing SQL Server through another system, so it is indirect access, but it is still working with live SQL data, they do still need to be licensed with CALs. So that multiplexing or going through another system does not take away the need for SQL CALs. So that would be the Server CAL licensing for SQL, but what about per processor licensing? Well, this just follows our normal per processor licensing model. So you would count up the number of physical processors in your server. And again, we do not charge more for multi-core processors. In this case, 4 physical processors per server. So in total, we would purchase 12 SQL Server processor licenses, and that would then license everybody to access the services of the server, be they the internal users or devices, the external people, or anyone who is multiplexing. They would all be covered by that per processor license. Now, with the per processor licensing, I did mention this on the slide previously, but you do need to think about the multi-core processors or hyper-threading, where one processor is again acting as if it is more than one processor. If you are licensing SQL in a physical environment, it is just one processor license per physical processor. We do not care about multi-core processors. We do not care about hyper-threading. We will not charge any extra for that. If SQL is installed in the virtual environment, the licensing is slightly different, and I will come to that again later in this presentation. So just to clarify, which editions of SQL Server follow which models? The standard and enterprise editions, you can license both with the client server or the per processor model, whereas the data center edition is just per processor licensing. The web edition and the parallel data warehouse, again, only licensed per processor. The developer edition is licensed per user following our developer license model. Compact and Express are both freely downloadable editions. And again, with Workgroup, you've got a choice of the client server model or the per processor model. For the editions of SQL Server that can be licensed either following the Server CAL licensing model or the per processor licensing model, a decision needs to be made as to which is going to be the best model to go for. And it really comes down to cost. How many users do you have versus the number of processors in the server? And there will be a tip over point where it becomes more cost effective to license per processor than Server CAL. So for instance, with the standard edition, if you're working on a 1 processor server at roughly 40 users, that is the point where you should be considering per processor licensing as opposed to the Server CAL licensing model. Whereas with the enterprise edition and 1 processor, it would be roughly 115 users. These are just estimates to give you a guideline as to where the tip over points come into play. Another thing to bear in mind is when you purchase SQL Server CALs, there are different types of CALs designed to access the different editions of SQL Server. So for instance, the SQL Server Workgroup CAL will only access, or it only licenses you, should I say, to access the Workgroup edition of SQL Server. Whereas the Small Business Server Premium CAL suite, which if you remember from earlier in the slide does include a SQL Server CAL, that licenses you for all of the editions shown here, Workgroup Standard and Enterprise. Or if you just go for the normal SQL CAL, that also licenses you to access all of those different editions of SQL Server. Another thing to bear in mind with SQL Server in the CALs is we have recently had the release of SQL Server 2008 R2. And this is a major release, and it does mean that any customer wanting to work with SQL Server 2008 R2 would have to have an updated server license. That would be an R2 server license. But also, they do need to have SQL Server 2008 R2 CALs. So any software assurance customers, any customer with SQL Server 2008 covered with software assurance at the time of the release of the R2 version, they would be fine. They would be licensed for SQL Server 2008 R2 and the CALs would be R2 CALs. But any customer who is not a software assurance customer wanting to move up to SQL Server 2008 R2 will need to purchase both a new server license and new CALs. Now, the next thing to have a look at is licensing SQL in a virtualized environment as opposed to in a physical environment. And just to explain my picture here, I have a picture of a server here, the physical server showing at the bottom, and it has 4 physical processors sitting inside of it. And it's then running Windows Server 2008 as its host operating system. Now, on this server, we have 4 virtual machines, each virtual machine with 2 virtual processors, a virtual operating system, and a number of running instances of SQL installed in that virtual operating system. So what we need to take a look at is how running SQL in a virtualized environment affects the licensing. So first of all, what we're going to look at is how you would license SQL Server Standard Edition running in virtual machines, but licensed through the Server CAL licensing model. So as you can see on this picture, we have 4 virtual machines, each running SQL Server. So for the Standard Edition, we would need to purchase 4 SQL Server Standard Edition server licenses, one for each virtual machine that SQL Server is running in. But each server license allows us to have an unlimited number of running instances of SQL in those virtual machines. So even though the picture here shows 4 running instances of SQL in those virtual machines, it could obviously be more than that per server license. As you can imagine, you would also need to purchase the appropriate CALs for the users or devices who are accessing this server. If we think about the Enterprise Edition of SQL Server, again licensed through the Server CAL licensing model, but running again, as the picture shows, SQL Server in 4 different virtual machines. With the Enterprise Edition, all we actually need to do is to license the physical server, and we would buy our SQL Server Enterprise Edition server license, assign it to the physical server, and that allows us then to have SQL running in up to 4 virtual machines on the server. Again, each virtual machine can have an unlimited number of running instances of SQL, but it can only run in up to 4 virtual machines. If we choose to license SQL Server per processor in a virtual environment, again, you get a grant of how many virtual machines you can run per processor license. So if it is the standard edition of SQL Server that you have licensed per processor, you are allowed to run 1 virtual machine per processor license. And this is assuming that you have licensed all the processors in your server. So if your server, for instance, had 2 physical processors in it, you've bought 2 processor licenses. At 1 virtual machine per processor license, you would be able to run SQL Server in 2 virtual machines. If it was the Enterprise Edition and you're allowed 4 virtual machines per processor license, if your server again had 2 physical processors in it, you've bought 2 SQL Server Enterprise Edition processor licenses, you would in total be allowed to run SQL Server in 8 virtual machines. And with the Data Center Edition, that is an unlimited number of virtual machines. So again, you would cover all of your processors in that machine with Data Center processor licenses, and you are then allowed to run SQL Server in an unlimited number of virtual machines. Now, when you purchase your SQL Server licenses, that license does include the license for a passive server. And this is great for implementing a failover setup. It's very important with SQL Server that it doesn't go down, especially as it is the back-end requirement to a lot of our other products. So the whole failover setup, what the license allows you to do is to run SQL Server on your main or your active server, but also have SQL Server running on a second passive server. And that passive server is a mirror image of that main active server. So if the main server goes down, you are then allowed to swap over and use the passive server. And you're allowed to use that for up to 30 days whilst you fix the main production server and get that back working again. After that, obviously, you'll carry on using the main server, and the passive server will remain as this mirror image of the main server in case of future failovers. Another thing to think about is moving around of SQL instances and also sort of SQL licenses. So let's take SQL Server virtual instances first of all. Now, as I said to you before, when you buy a SQL Server license, you would assign that license to the server. And that license then allows you to have this unlimited number of running instances of SQL Server on your server. So in our picture here, we've got two servers with SQL Server licenses assigned to them. Both have with running instances of SQL Server on them. And what we can do with SQL Server is happily move those running instances freely between the two licensed servers. So we've got to think of here again things like failover, load balancing. There's a number of reasons why companies might want to move their running instances of SQL around. But as long as the servers that they're moving to have licenses assigned to them, that's absolutely fine. However, what happens if you want to move a server license and you want to reassign a SQL Server license from one server to another, be that server in the same server farm that you're working with or in a different server farm? Now, if you want to move from one server farm to another, the rules are that this can only be done every 90 days, and that is irrelevant of what edition of SQL Server you've purchased. So whether you've bought the Standard, Enterprise or Data Center edition, there is a 90-day rule for moving licenses between one server farm and another. If you want to move the licenses between servers in the same server farm, if it is a Standard edition license, again, you are only allowed to move that every 90 days. However, if it's an Enterprise or Data Center edition license, that server license can effectively be freely moved around between the servers, giving maximum mobility, again for load balancing situations. So how this is really licensed varies again depending on whether you're going for the server CAL licensing or per processor licensing. So let's think about Server CAL to begin with, and let's just take the Enterprise edition of SQL Server. Now, in our server farm here at the bottom, you'll see we have 5 separate physical servers, but we only have SQL Server running on 3 of those 5 servers. But as a company, we might want to freely move our SQL Server instances between all 5 servers and ensure that we're truly licensed for this. So if you're following the Server CAL licensing model with Enterprise Edition, you would count up the maximum number of servers that at any one point in time will be running SQL Server. So if we were only ever going to be running SQL on any 3 of those 5 servers, then we would only need to purchase 3 SQL Server Enterprise Edition licenses, plus, again, obviously the appropriate number of CALs. Whereas if we were licensing per processor, what you actually have to do is to count up the number of processors that might be supporting SQL at any one point in time. So in our 5 servers, we have 10 processors altogether because each server is a 2-processor server. But again, if we only ever had 6 processors supporting SQL on the whole server farm, we would only need to purchase 6 processor licenses. And that means that SQL can happily be running on any of those 5 servers as long as we don't have more than 6 processors supporting SQL at any one point in time. And this makes the whole license mobility side of things much more flexible when it comes to SQL. Now, when it comes to licensing the SQL components, if as an organisation you've put all of the SQL components on just one server, that's fine. You just purchase the one server license and obviously life is great. But one thing companies might want to do is actually split the different components of SQL Server out onto different servers. So you might have the reporting services running on one server, the analysis services running on another server. And if you do that, you do need to purchase extra SQL Server licenses. So for any server running the components of SQL Server, they would need to have a SQL Server license. Now, just additional sort of rights that you get with SQL Server. So when you purchase SQL Server, you will get it in, kind of 32-bit, 64-bit and Itanium. So you are allowed to install SQL Server on whatever platform you want. You don't have to buy the specific platform, you just get all of them. And there are also step-up licenses available for software assurance customers. So for instance, a customer who's got SQL Server Workgroup Edition with software assurance, they would be able to step up to the standard edition. Again, a standard edition customer with SA would be able to step up to enterprise, and an enterprise edition customer with SA would be able to step up to data center, meaning that a customer can easily move up to a higher edition of SQL Server if they so desire. Okay, so as this presentation draws to an end, let's just take a quick review of what we've done. We've looked at what Small Business Server is and how it's licensed. Again, had an overview of BizTalk Server and the licensing requirements there. And finally, taken a dive into SQL Server, looking at licensing it both in the physical and virtual environments. So that concludes this presentation. I hope you've enjoyed listening to it and wish you the best of luck when taking the associated assessment. Goodbye.